You don't feel tired because life is hard. You feel tired because someone is slowly draining you. 6 months ago, she entered your life like a promise. Warm, intense, electric. She made you feel chosen, necessary, alive. Now it's 2 p.m. Your phone vibrates and your chest tightens before you even read the message. You're exhausted, anxious, and quietly disconnected from yourself. And you keep asking the wrong question, what's wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you. What you're experiencing isn't love stress or bad timing. It's psychological erosion. Subtle, consistent, deliberate. Toxic women don't look dangerous. If they did, you'd leave. They look wounded, desirable, just broken enough to trigger your instinct to stay. And while you're trying to protect them, they're dismantling you, piece by piece. This story isn't about villains or victims. It's about how control hides behind affection, how chaos disguises itself as passion, and how good men lose themselves without realizing it. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. And if conversations like this matter to you, consider subscribing. Calmly. No pressure. When I look back, the beginning didn't feel dangerous. It felt precise, controlled, almost cinematic. She didn't rush in loudly. She arrived quietly like someone who understood timing. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered details. She asked questions that made me feel seen, not interrogated. There was nothing aggressive about her presence. That's what made it effective. The connection hit fast, but it didn't feel reckless. It felt inevitable, like recognition. She mirrored my values without copying them. She admired my discipline, my focus, my ability to stay calm under pressure. She said most men she met were unstable, unreliable, emotionally unavailable. I was different. I heard that sentence often. It landed deeper every time. I didn't notice the pattern yet. I only noticed how good it felt to be chosen. Her stories came early, not dumped all at once. Measured, strategic, a difficult childhood, abandonment, men who promised safety and delivered chaos. She didn't ask me to save her. She never had to. The implication was enough. I stepped into the role without realizing I was being positioned. I told myself this was intimacy, vulnerability, trust. What I didn't see was how quickly my empathy became leverage. She praised my stability, then quietly leaned on it. She admired my strength, then tested how much of it she could take before I bent. When she said she'd never felt safe with anyone before, I felt responsibility lock in, not obligation. Something worse, purpose. The affection was intense, but inconsistent. Long stretches of closeness followed by sudden distance. When she pulled away, she didn't explain. She didn't accuse, she just changed temperature. And I adjusted myself without being asked. I answered faster. I showed up more. I listened harder. I thought I was being attentive. I was actually being trained. She used sweetness like a currency. Compliments were given just often enough to keep me invested, never enough to make me secure. When I did something right, the reward was warmth. When I didn't, the reward disappeared. No arguments, no conflict, just absence. That silence did more damage than anger ever could. I started measuring my behavior against her mood, not consciously at first. It crept in quietly. If she was distant, I replayed conversations. If she was cold, I searched for mistakes. I became careful, then cautious, then controlled. I told myself this was love requiring effort. What it actually required was submission. Sex became part of the bond early, but it wasn't reckless. It was focused, intentional, intimate in a way that blurred judgment. physical closeness accelerated emotional attachment. The highs were intense enough to erase memory. The lows were subtle enough to rationalize. Every time something felt off, she countered it with vulnerability. Tears didn't come often, but when they did, they landed with precision. She cried about being misunderstood, about people leaving, about feeling like she was too much. I reassured her, repeatedly. Each time I did, I reinforced the role she was assigning me. I didn't see manipulation. I saw a woman who had been hurt and finally found someone stable enough to stay. I didn't realize that stability was exactly what made me valuable, not as a partner, as a resource. The early chemistry created a false baseline. I kept chasing that version of her, the attentive one, the warm one, the woman who looked at me like I was the answer to something unresolved. Every time the connection fractured, I assumed the solution was effort, more patience, more understanding, less resistance. I told myself relationships require sacrifice. I didn't notice I was the only one sacrificing clarity. She never asked directly for control. She didn't need to. She let me offer it. I adjusted my schedule to accommodate her moods. I delayed plans to avoid conflict. I explained myself preemptively. Not because she demanded it, but because I learned the cost of not doing it. Discomfort. The trap wasn't built with cruelty. It was built with implication, with the suggestion that if I were just a little more careful, a little more available, a little more patient, things would stay good. I believed that. And that belief slowly replaced my instincts. I ignored the moments when my body reacted before my mind did. The tightness in my chest before seeing her name on my phone, the fatigue that didn't match my workload, the subtle dread before conversations that hadn't even started yet. I called it stress. I called it commitment. I didn't call it what it was. By the time I noticed something was wrong, I was already invested in the version of her that existed mostly in my memory. I wasn't responding to who she was. I was loyal to who she had been in the beginning, or who I thought she was. That's the most effective part of the trap. It doesn't convince you with lies. It hooks you with truth, then slowly removes access to it. She didn't change overnight. She didn't flip personalities. She adjusted margins. Slightly colder, slightly more demanding, slightly less consistent. Just enough to destabilize without alerting. If she had been obviously cruel, I would have left. If she had been openly hostile, I would have drawn a line. But she wasn't. She was wounded, sensitive, complicated. And I mistook complexity for depth. I didn't realize that the intensity wasn't connection. It was acceleration, a way to bypass discernment, a way to make questioning feel like betrayal. Once emotional speed exceeds clarity, control becomes effortless. I wasn't falling in love. I was being positioned. By the time I started feeling uneasy, I was already emotionally invested in fixing something that had been designed to keep breaking. I thought I was protecting a relationship. In reality, I was protecting the illusion that the beginning represented the truth. That illusion is powerful, strong enough to keep a rational man explaining behavior that never needed explanation, strong enough to make discomfort feel like growth, strong enough to make erosion feel like responsibility. This is where it starts, not with pain, with promise. And once that promise becomes the standard you're trying to recover, everything else becomes negotiable, including yourself. The confusion didn't arrive as chaos. It arrived as contrast. One day she spoke to me with warmth, certainty, admiration. She told me I was the best thing that had ever happened to her. She said she felt calm with me, safe, grounded. I believed her because in those moments, it felt real. Her voice softened. Her eyes settled. The connection felt solid. The next day, the temperature dropped. No explanation, no warning. Messages became short. Responses slowed. When I asked what was wrong, she said nothing. Or worse, she said, "If you don't know, that's part of the problem." That sentence lodged itself in my head. I replayed conversations, searching for offenses that didn't exist. I scanned my tone, my timing, my words. I assumed accountability before evidence. Not because I was guilty, but because guilt felt safer than uncertainty. By the third shift, she cried. She told me everyone always left, that she tried so hard and still ended up alone, that she was tired of being misunderstood. The tears weren't loud. They were controlled, measured, and they worked. I moved closer. I reassured her. I apologized for things she never clearly accused me of. That's when the cycle locked in. Affection, withdrawal, victimhood, threat. When things felt calm, she destabilized them. When I felt confident, she introduced doubt. When I relaxed, she created urgency. Every emotional state was temporary, except one: vigilance. I never knew which version of her I would get. And because of that, I stayed alert, attentive, reactive. I learned her patterns without realizing they were patterns. Monday warmth, Tuesday silence, Wednesday tears, Thursday threats. By Friday, my internal compass was scrambled. That wasn't accidental. She didn't just tell stories. She rewrote reality. Arguments didn't unfold as I remembered them. If she raised her voice for an hour, it was because I provoked her. If she went through my phone while I slept, it was because I made her insecure. If she disappeared for a night and refused to explain, my concern became control. Every event ended the same way. I was the cause. She was the consequence. I started questioning my perception, not openly, quietly. I asked myself if I was insensitive, if I missed cues, if I expected too much, if I was somehow lacking emotional intelligence. She never had to say I was wrong. She just framed every situation so that I arrived at that conclusion myself. That's the most effective kind of manipulation, the kind where you participate. She took my strengths and inverted them. My calm became indifference. My boundaries became cruelty. My independence became emotional unavailability. My success made her feel small, so it had to be minimized. Jokes became criticism. Achievements became threats. My friendships changed next. She never told me to cut anyone off. She didn't need to. She planted doubt, said my friends didn't respect our relationship, that they didn't understand her, that they judged her unfairly. When I defended them, she withdrew affection. When I distanced myself from them, she rewarded me. I made the adjustment without being told. Family followed the same pattern. She said they didn't see the real her, that they were biased, that they interfered. Eventually, every outside voice that could ground me became an enemy to the relationship. Isolation didn't happen suddenly. It happened logically, reasonably. Step by step, the world narrowed. Her emotions became the weather system I lived under. When she was calm, the day was good. When she wasn't, everything stopped. Plans dissolved. Focus disappeared. I became reactive to her state instead of intentional about my own. I didn't notice how much of myself I was losing because I was busy managing something that never stabilized. The chaos felt personal, but it wasn't. It was structural. When life was smooth, she created friction. When I felt happy, she introduced a problem. When I succeeded, she manufactured a crisis that demanded my full attention. Peace made her restless. Calm gave me space to think, and thinking was dangerous to the dynamic. She needed me off balance. I thought we were fighting problems. We were actually maintaining a system. My body recognized the truth before my mind accepted it. I woke up tired without reason. My shoulders stayed tense. Headaches became routine. My appetite shifted. I felt like I was constantly bracing for impact, even during quiet moments. That wasn't stress from work. That was my nervous system stuck in alert mode. I loved someone who hurt me, and my brain was trying to reconcile two realities that couldn't coexist. That contradiction created cognitive dissonance, and my body paid the price. Still, I stayed. I told myself she was complicated, that relationships were hard, that this was what commitment looked like when things got real. I framed endurance as loyalty, confusion as depth, instability as passion. I didn't realize I was living inside a psychological loop designed to keep me questioning myself instead of questioning the structure. She didn't need to be cruel all the time. That would have broken the spell. She only needed to be unpredictable. Just enough kindness to keep me hoping. Just enough pain to keep me adjusting. I kept trying to return to the beginning, to the version of her that felt safe. I didn't understand that the beginning wasn't the baseline. It was the bait. By the time I started sensing that something was fundamentally wrong, my confidence was already eroded. I trusted her interpretation of events more than my own memory. I explained myself when no explanation was required. I defended my character to someone committed to misunderstanding it. That's when the truth became unavoidable. This wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't incompatibility. It wasn't emotional volatility. It was control through instability. And the more I tried to fix it, the deeper I sank. Once I understood that instability wasn't accidental, this pattern became impossible to ignore. What I had taken as emotional volatility was actually precision. The chaos wasn't random. It was aimed. She studied what made me strong and applied pressure there. My kindness was the first target. She reframed it as weakness. If I tried to be patient, I was avoiding accountability. If I stayed calm, I didn't care enough. If I forgave quickly, I was dismissing her pain. Every instinct that once made me a grounded man became something she could use against me. I started second-guessing traits I had never questioned before. Then came my success. At first, she admired it. She spoke about how driven I was, how disciplined, how reliable. But admiration slowly curdled into comparison. She said my work made her feel small, that my focus meant I didn't prioritize her enough, that my ambition created distance. Every win became evidence of neglect. Every achievement required emotional repayment. I learned to downplay progress, to soften milestones, to hide satisfaction. Success triggered tension, and tension was expensive. So I reduced myself. Friendships didn't survive intact. She never demanded I choose. She just made it uncomfortable not to. When I spent time with friends, she became withdrawn. When I talked about them, she questioned their intentions. When they disagreed with her, she took it personally. Slowly, the message became clear without being spoken. Connection outside the relationship was a threat. I didn't cut people off in one clean decision. I postponed calls. I canceled plans. I explained less. Over time, distance replaced presence. And when I noticed the gap, it felt too awkward to bridge. Isolation didn't require force. It required fatigue. Family followed. She said they didn't understand us, that they judged her unfairly, that they interfered. When they expressed concern, she framed it as disrespect. When I defended them, she withdrew emotionally. When I sided with her, she rewarded me with closeness. The incentive structure was clear. Support systems became liabilities. What remained was the relationship and the constant effort required to maintain it. Every interaction felt like a test I didn't know I was taking. Every conversation carried stakes. I weighed my words carefully. I managed tone. I anticipated reactions. I lived in a state of permanent calibration. That's how control deepens, not through domination, but through dependency. She didn't want partnership. She wanted centrality. Everything else had to orbit her emotional state. My energy became fuel. My attention became currency. My presence became proof. When things were calm, she became restless. Peace didn't satisfy her. It threatened her. Calm meant space, and space meant I might think clearly. So she introduced problems, small at first, then urgent, then dramatic. If I was happy, something was wrong. If I felt grounded, there had to be a conversation. If I was succeeding, a crisis appeared that demanded my full emotional availability. My life stopped responding to my priorities and started reacting to hers. I wasn't living. I was managing volatility. The structure was efficient. When I complied, the system rewarded me with moments of warmth. When I resisted, it punished me with coldness, guilt, or escalation. Over time, I internalized the rules. I stopped asking what I wanted. I started asking what would keep things stable. But stability never came. That was the point. The chaos wasn't a byproduct, it was the mechanism. When I was off balance, I was easier to guide. When I was exhausted, I was less likely to resist. When I was confused, I deferred judgment. Control thrives where clarity is absent. I noticed how often my body reacted before my mind did. A tight chest when her name appeared on my phone. A shallow breath before difficult conversations that hadn't started yet. A constant sense of vigilance, like something was always about to go wrong. That wasn't intuition failing me. It was intuition trying to warn me. But I overrode it with explanations. I told myself she was sensitive, that she'd been hurt, that she needed understanding. I mistook endurance for love and tolerance for maturity. I didn't see that I was being reduced to a function. I existed to regulate her emotions, to absorb instability, to provide reassurance without receiving it, to stay predictable so she could remain unpredictable. The imbalance was structural, not situational. The most damaging part wasn't what she did. It was what I stopped doing. I stopped trusting my perception. I stopped asserting needs. I stopped feeling entitled to peace. I stopped expecting reciprocity. I accepted confusion as normal and exhaustion as the cost of connection. I told myself this was what commitment looked like when it got difficult. What I didn't understand yet was that difficulty and destruction aren't the same thing. She wasn't chaotic because she couldn't help it. She was chaotic because it worked. The instability kept me focused on her instead of myself. The emotional whiplash kept me invested. The constant repair kept me engaged. I was always fixing something, and because something was always broken, I never stopped. That's how strategically toxic dynamics operate. They don't attack you directly. They dismantle your support, erode your confidence, and exhaust your capacity to resist. By the time you realize what's happening, you're too depleted to leave easily. I didn't feel trapped because there were no bars, just obligations, just guilt, just the quiet fear that if I stepped away, something terrible would happen and it would be my fault. That fear kept me compliant longer than anger ever could. I thought I was choosing her. I didn't realize how little choice I had left. And that was when the damage became undeniable. The first thing to break wasn't my confidence. It was my body. I didn't connect the symptoms at first. I told myself I was busy, that work was demanding, that stress was normal. But the fatigue didn't match my schedule. I slept, but I didn't recover. I woke up already tired, like I had been running all night without moving. My shoulders stayed tight, my jaw ached. Headaches came and went without warning. My appetite shifted. Some weeks I barely ate. Other weeks I ate out of habit, not hunger. My weight moved without intention. None of it felt dramatic enough to panic, but all of it felt wrong. My nervous system was stuck in a state of alert. Every message from her triggered a response before I could think. Heart rate up, breath shallow, mind racing. I would see her name on my phone and feel tension spread through my chest, not fear, anticipation. Like I was bracing for impact. That isn't love. That's a fight or flight response. My mind was trying to make sense of a contradiction it couldn't resolve. I cared deeply about someone who consistently hurt me. I wanted closeness with someone who destabilized me. I was loyal to someone who made me doubt myself. That cognitive dissonance demanded energy, and my body was paying the cost. I started forgetting things, small details, conversations, commitments. Not because I didn't care, but because my attention was fragmented. I was always scanning for emotional shifts, always preparing for the next conversation, always managing tension that hadn't arrived yet. Rest didn't exist. Even in quiet moments, my system stayed activated. I couldn't fully relax because I knew calm never lasted. Peace felt temporary. I waited for the interruption. I noticed how different I felt around other people. With friends or co-workers, my body softened, my breathing slowed, my thoughts cleared. The moment I returned to her orbit, the tension came back. That contrast was information. I ignored it. I told myself this was the cost of loving someone deeply. That intensity required sacrifice. That emotional complexity came with physical consequences. I was wrong. My body wasn't responding to love. It was responding to threat, not physical danger. Psychological threat, unpredictability, the constant need to monitor, adapt, and appease. The absence of safety. Safety isn't comfort. It's predictability. It's knowing where you stand. It's not having to guess whether your presence will be welcomed or punished. I didn't have that. Instead, I had cycles. Warmth followed by withdrawal. Closeness followed by criticism. Calm followed by conflict. My nervous system learned the pattern and stayed on high alert to protect me. The problem was the threat never resolved, so the alert never shut off. Chronic stress doesn't announce itself loudly. It erodes quietly. I lost motivation for things that once mattered. Not because I stopped caring, but because I was depleted. Every interaction required calculation. Every conversation carried emotional weight. There was no surplus left for growth, creativity, or joy. I became irritable without knowing why. Small inconveniences felt heavier than they should. My patience shortened. My tolerance dropped. I didn't recognize myself, and that scared me more than the relationship ever did. I started wondering if something was wrong with me, if I was becoming unstable, if I was failing to manage stress like a competent adult. I didn't see that the environment was unsustainable. I blamed myself because that was easier than questioning the structure I was invested in. My body kept sending signals: tight chest, shallow breathing, fatigue, digestive issues, restlessness. They were consistent, predictable, aligned with exposure to her emotional volatility. But I intellectualized them away. I told myself I was overreacting, that everyone felt this way in relationships, that this was normal, that I just needed to be stronger. That belief kept me stuck. The hardest part was that there were still good moments. Calm nights, warm conversations, physical closeness. Those moments reset my tolerance. They made the stress feel worth it. They convinced me the damage was temporary. But my body didn't forget what my mind tried to justify. Each cycle took more from me than the last. Recovery took longer. The baseline dropped. What once felt like tension became my default state. I stopped noticing it because it became familiar. That's how chronic stress becomes invisible. It stops feeling abnormal. I didn't realize how compromised I was until I experienced a stretch of distance. A few days without contact. No arguments, no emotional management. Just quiet. Sleep returned. Appetite normalized. My shoulders dropped. The contrast was undeniable. My body knew the truth long before I was ready to accept it. The relationship wasn't just emotionally draining. It was physiologically damaging. I was living in a state of constant threat response, and my system was deteriorating under the load. This wasn't about compatibility. It wasn't about communication. It wasn't about effort. It was about safety. And there was none. I wasn't weak for feeling this way. I wasn't broken. I wasn't failing at love. I was responding normally to an abnormal environment. Anyone placed under constant emotional unpredictability would break down eventually. The body always keeps score. I had ignored the signals because leaving felt harder than enduring. Because admitting the truth meant confronting how much of myself I had already lost. Because I believed that understanding her pain was more important than honoring my own. That belief nearly cost me my health. By the time I stopped dismissing my body's warnings, the damage was already deep. I wasn't just tired. I was depleted. Not just stressed. Dysregulated. And that was when I understood something I couldn't unsee. If staying required me to sacrifice my nervous system, my clarity, and my physical well-being, then whatever this was, it wasn't love. It was survival disguised as commitment. The moment everything changed didn't arrive during a fight. It arrived during a pause. For the first time in months, I felt something solid inside me. Not anger, not exhaustion. Resolve. Quiet and immovable. I didn't plan it. I didn't rehearse it. I simply reached a limit I could no longer explain away. She was raising her voice again, repeating the same accusations, shifting blame without evidence, waiting for me to fold like I always did. My body reacted out of habit, but my words didn't follow. I said no, not defensively, not emotionally, just clearly. I told her I wouldn't continue the conversation while she was yelling. No explanation, no justification, no apology attached. I meant it. There was a fraction of a second where her face changed. A brief flash of something unfiltered. Shock, then disbelief, then anger. It moved quickly, but it was there. That was the moment she realized something fundamental had shifted. The manipulation came immediately after. Tears followed rage. Victimhood replaced accusation. She said I was cold, that I was abandoning her, that if I loved her, I wouldn't shut down, that she couldn't believe I was treating her like this. I didn't argue. I repeated the boundary and disengaged. That was enough to trigger a reaction I had never fully seen before. The volume increased. The narrative intensified. She reframed my calm as cruelty, my limit as betrayal, my refusal to engage as proof that I didn't care. This wasn't conflict. It was exposure. Until that moment, I didn't fully understand how much of the dynamic relied on my compliance, on my emotional availability, on my willingness to absorb chaos to keep things stable. The second I removed that supply, the system destabilized. I had been conditioned to believe that boundaries were selfish, that saying no meant I was unkind, that protecting my peace made me difficult. Those beliefs weren't mine originally. They were installed over time through guilt, pressure, and repetition. A boundary doesn't control the other person. It defines your participation. That distinction matters. I wasn't telling her what to do. I was telling her what I would no longer tolerate. And that threatened the structure more than any argument ever had. She accused me of changing. She said I wasn't the man she fell in love with. She implied that I was becoming emotionally unavailable, that I was weaponizing calm, that I was using boundaries as punishment. None of that was true. But it wasn't meant to be. The goal wasn't accuracy. It was pressure. She needed me to doubt myself, to explain, to soften, to renegotiate, to return to the version of myself that prioritized her emotions over my limits. When I didn't, the escalation intensified. She cried about abandonment, compared me to her exes, suggested I was repeating their cruelty. She implied she might leave. That threat had worked before. This time, it didn't land. I didn't chase. That silence unsettled her more than any argument ever could. This was the first time I saw the pattern clearly. Every time I tried to set a boundary in the past, she responded with emotional terrorism. Guilt, accusation, crisis. She trained me to associate self-protection with pain. Over time, I stopped trying because it was easier to comply than to face the fallout. But boundaries aren't requests. They're statements of fact. You don't ask someone to respect your limits. You enforce them through action. You don't negotiate your non-negotiables. You don't explain why basic respect matters. You state what you will and won't accept, and you follow through. I hadn't done that before. Not consistently, not without guilt. This time was different. I realized something important in that moment. The intensity of her reaction wasn't proof that I was wrong. It was proof that the boundary was real. Healthy people respond to boundaries with understanding. Toxic people respond with escalation. She tested it immediately. She raised her voice again to see if I would stay. I left the room. She accused me of being dramatic. I didn't respond. She followed me, demanding resolution. I repeated the boundary and disengaged. Each test revealed the same thing. She wasn't confused. She was threatened. The dynamic depended on my lack of limits. My boundaries interrupted her access to my emotional energy, and she didn't like it. She needed me reactive, engaged, available. Without boundaries, I was predictable. With boundaries, I became uncontrollable. That terrified her. I felt guilt rise inside me, strong and sharp. My mind told me I was being cruel, that a good man wouldn't do this, that I was abandoning someone in pain. That voice wasn't my conscience. It was conditioning. She had trained me to equate her distress with my responsibility. Breaking that link felt wrong because it was unfamiliar, not because it was unethical. I wasn't withdrawing love. I was withdrawing access. That distinction changed everything. The calm I felt wasn't detachment yet. It was clarity. I saw how every past conflict had been framed to keep me engaged and apologetic. I saw how my attempts at self-protection had been reframed as harm. I saw how much of myself I had surrendered to avoid being seen as the villain. Saying no didn't end the chaos. It revealed its source. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I understood then that boundaries weren't the end of the relationship. They were the end of the illusion that this could continue without costing me myself. That moment didn't make me free, but it made me awake. And awakening is irreversible. Once the boundary was set, the real test began. She didn't accept it. She studied it. Every limit I stated became something she pushed against. Not subtly, precisely. When I said I wouldn't stay in conversations where I was being yelled at, the volume increased. When I said I needed space to cool down, she invaded it. When I said certain behavior was unacceptable, that exact behavior appeared more often. This wasn't confusion, it was calibration. Toxic dynamics don't collapse when you set boundaries. They escalate. Because boundaries threaten access, and access is the currency. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She was testing whether my words carried consequences or if they were just suggestions wrapped in confidence. I learned quickly that explanation was a mistake. The moment I tried to clarify why a boundary mattered, she turned my reasoning into ammunition. My words were dissected, reframed, weaponized. If I said I needed respect, she accused me of implying she was disrespectful. If I said I needed calm, she said I was silencing her. If I said I needed consistency, she said I was controlling. So I stopped explaining. Boundaries don't require justification. They require enforcement. I didn't say, please stop yelling, it hurts my feelings. I said, I won't continue this conversation while you're yelling. No emotion, no defense, no debate. That neutrality frustrated her more than anger ever could. She wanted reaction. She needed engagement. My calm starved the dynamic, and starvation triggers panic. The pushback intensified. She cried, then she raged. Then she became the victim. Then she threatened to leave. Then she actually left. Then she came back acting like nothing happened. Each move was familiar. I had seen them all before. The difference was, this time, I didn't chase. She recruited others. Friends were suddenly involved. Stories were told. Pressure was applied. I was framed as cold, distant, unreasonable. The narrative was designed to corner me emotionally, to force me to re-engage, to defend my character. I didn't. I understood something critical in that phase. Boundaries aren't about controlling her behavior. They're about controlling my participation. I wasn't telling her what to do. I was telling her what I would do if the behavior continued. That distinction matters because healthy people understand it immediately. Toxic people pretend not to understand because confusion is another manipulation tactic. When I didn't react the way she expected, she escalated to extremes. Accusations became dramatic. Issues became emergencies. Minor disagreements turned into existential threats to the relationship. This wasn't because the issues were serious. It was because the tactics were failing. A toxic person doesn't need you to agree. They need you to engage. Agreement is optional. Attention is mandatory. When attention is withdrawn, they lose leverage. I noticed how often she tried to pull me back into old roles. She said I was different, that I used to care more, that I wasn't the man she fell in love with. That hurt. Not because it was true, but because it was designed to. She was mourning the version of me she could control. I felt the urge to soften, to reassure, to explain that I still cared. That instinct was strong. It came from the same place that kept me trapped before. The belief that it was my job to regulate her emotions. I didn't act on it. Every time I held the boundary, the reaction grew louder. That was expected. Boundaries reveal dependency. The more someone relies on your lack of limits, the more aggressively they respond when limits appear. I stopped negotiating my non-negotiables. I didn't debate respect. I didn't explain why yelling was unacceptable. I didn't argue about basic decency. I stated what I would participate in, and what I wouldn't, and then acted accordingly. That consistency changed the dynamic. She could no longer predict my reactions. She couldn't trigger me into apologizing. She couldn't guilt me into compliance. The emotional button she used for months stopped working. And when manipulation fails, exposure begins. Her behavior became more obvious, more extreme, less coherent. The escalation stripped away the subtlety that had kept me confused. When calm no longer worked, she reached for chaos. When guilt failed, she used fear. When fear failed, she used silence. None of it moved me. I wasn't detached yet, but I was no longer programmable. That phase was exhausting in a different way. Holding boundaries requires energy at first. The guilt doesn't disappear immediately. It fights back. It tells you you're cruel, that you're abandoning someone, that a good man would try harder. But guilt isn't truth. It's conditioning. The more consistently I enforced my boundaries, the clearer everything became. I saw how often she had crossed lines without consequence. I saw how my previous flexibility had been mistaken for permission. I saw how much of the relationship depended on my willingness to self-abandon. Boundaries didn't make me unkind. They made me visible. And once I became visible as someone with limits, the relationship couldn't function the way it used to. The structure was collapsing. She needed me boundaryless. I needed myself intact. Those two things couldn't coexist. By the end of that phase, I understood something with certainty. This wasn't about improving the relationship. It was about survival. My boundaries weren't punishment. They were protection. Not walls to keep her out, but gates that determined who and what had access to my life. And for the first time, I controlled those gates. The moment I stopped reacting, everything changed. Not immediately, not quietly, but unmistakably. She sent a message in the middle of the day. Short, vague, heavy. We need to talk about what you did. No context, no detail. Just enough uncertainty to hijack my attention. In the past, that single sentence would have owned my mind for hours. I would replay every interaction, searching for mistakes. I would draft apologies for crimes I hadn't committed yet. My body would tense. My focus would vanish. This time I recognized the tactic. It wasn't communication. It was emotional fishing. She wasn't trying to resolve anything. She was planting a hook and waiting for a reaction. Confusion, anxiety, urgency. Any emotional response would do. That was the reward. I didn't bite. I replied calmly. Okay, we can talk when I get home. Then I went back to my day. That was it. No reassurance, no panic, no follow-up questions, no over-explaining. Just a neutral response that offered nothing to feed on. And somewhere, I knew she felt it. Toxic dynamics run on emotional supply. Anger feeds them. Fear empowers them. Confusion keeps you engaged. Even attempts to fix things give them leverage. They don't start conflict to solve problems. They start conflict to generate emotional chaos. I had been a reliable source until I wasn't. When she tried to provoke me with yelling later that night, I didn't argue. I said, "We can talk when you're calm," and left the room. No debate, no lecture, no raised voice. When she guilted me, I didn't defend myself. I said, "I'm sorry you feel that way," and changed the subject. When she tried to reopen arguments from months ago, I said, "I'm not discussing this," and returned to what I was doing. Each response was boring, predictable, emotionally flat. That was the point. Neutrality is kryptonite to manipulation. She threw emotional grenades, and I responded like we were discussing the weather. She escalated, and I stayed steady. She pressed buttons that used to trigger me, and nothing happened. It wasn't because I didn't feel anything. I felt everything. But I stopped expressing it where it could be used against me. This wasn't coldness, it was strategy. The power of disengagement isn't that it calms the toxic person. It doesn't. It forces them to escalate. And escalation reveals the truth. When level 1 manipulation fails, they jump to level 10. She began melting down over trivial things. A towel left on the bed, a delayed response, a neutral tone. The reactions became disproportionate, illogical, impossible to justify. She was screaming while I was making coffee, accusing while I was reading, threatening while I was calm. For the first time, I wasn't inside the storm. I was observing it. That distance changed everything. Toxic people need you emotionally reactive because it validates their behavior. If you're calm, they can't blame you. If you're grounded, they have nowhere to project. When you disengage, they're left alone with themselves. And they hate that. I noticed how predictable her tactics were once I stopped participating. First guilt, then blame, then triangulation. Other people agree with me. Then silence. Complete radio silence designed to make me panic and beg for connection. In the past, silence terrified me. It felt like abandonment. Now it felt like space. I didn't chase. Silence is only punishment if you fear being alone. Once you don't, it loses power. She wanted me desperate, apologetic, unstable. She wanted me reaching out, trying to fix something that hadn't broken. My non-reaction forced her to confront the fact that her tools weren't working anymore. That's when I understood something critical. She wasn't overwhelmed by emotion. She was using emotion as a weapon. Every tear had timing. Every outburst had purpose. Every accusation had a goal. I had mistaken intensity for authenticity because I was emotionally invested. Distance stripped the illusion away. The hardest part of disengagement wasn't resisting her. It was resisting myself. The urge to explain was strong, to clarify, to prove I wasn't the villain she painted me as, to defend my character. That urge came from the same place that kept me trapped. The need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding me. I let it pass. Disengagement isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's choosing not to enter rooms that are on fire. It's refusing to attend emotional courtrooms where the verdict is already decided. It's understanding that not every accusation deserves a response. When I stopped reacting, she had to work harder to provoke me. And the harder she worked, the clearer everything became. Her behavior stopped looking complex. It started looking repetitive. I wasn't dealing with a mystery anymore. I was watching a script. And once you see the script, you can't be cast in the role again. There was no satisfaction in this phase. No victory. Just clarity. And clarity is sobering. I realized how much of my life had been consumed by managing reactions that were never about resolution. How many hours I had spent emotionally dysregulated over manufactured crises. How much energy I had poured into a dynamic that required me to stay confused to function. Disengagement returned something to me that I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, not happiness. Peace, the absence of tension, the absence of anticipation, the absence of constant emotional readiness. My nervous system began to settle. My thoughts slowed. My sleep improved. I wasn't winning an argument. I was exiting a battlefield. And that's when the truth became undeniable. The only way to win this game was to stop playing. The hardest truth didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with emptiness. Once I disengaged, once the chaos lost its grip, I expected relief to feel dramatic. It didn't. It felt quiet, sparse, almost uncomfortable. Without the constant emotional emergencies, there was space. And in that space, that one realization stood still, unavoidable. I couldn't save her. That belief had shaped everything. The idea that if I just loved her better, understood her deeper, adjusted myself more carefully, she would finally stabilize. Become soft again. Return to the version I met at the beginning. I had treated the relationship like a problem to solve, instead of a reality to accept. I wasn't her therapist. I wasn't her father. I wasn't a rehabilitation center. I was just a man destroying himself, trying to heal someone who didn't want to be healed. That truth was brutal because it stripped away my purpose inside the dynamic. If I wasn't there to fix her, then why was I there at all? The answer was uncomfortable. I was there because being needed felt like worth. Because chaos gave me a role. Because when she was unraveling, I felt important. Letting go of that role felt like losing identity. Emotional detachment isn't hatred. Hatred would have been easier. Rage still keeps you emotionally connected. It still gives the other person power. She would have preferred my anger over my absence. At least anger meant she still controlled my emotional state. Indifference was different. Indifference was silence where reaction used to live. It was observing without absorbing. It was recognizing manipulation without responding to it. It was seeing her behavior the way you see a stranger having a meltdown in public. Mild concern, zero responsibility. I stopped carrying her emotions like they were mine. When she was sad, I didn't scramble to fix it. When she was angry, I didn't absorb it. When she was anxious, I didn't drop everything to regulate her. I didn't rush over at midnight. I didn't replay arguments. I didn't prepare speeches in my head. Her emotions stopped being my assignment. That shift felt cruel at first. The guilt was heavy. My mind told me I was abandoning someone who needed help. That a good man wouldn't walk away. That strength meant endurance. But that guilt wasn't moral. It was conditioned. She had trained me to believe that her emotional state was my responsibility. That if she was hurting, I had failed. Breaking that link felt wrong because it was unfamiliar, not because it was unethical. I wasn't being cruel, I was being accurate. When she tried to pull me back into arguments about the past, I declined. When she created drama late at night, I went to sleep. When she threatened self-harm to manipulate me into staying, I called emergency services and stepped away. I refused to play hero in situations that required professionals. That boundary was firm. I understood something critical then. Staying engaged wasn't helping her. It was enabling her. It was allowing the behavior to continue without consequence. Detachment wasn't abandonment. It was the removal of reinforcement. The guilt faded slowly. Not because I stopped caring, but because I started seeing clearly. Choosing peace over engagement made me boring to her. And toxic people can't survive boredom. They need intensity the way a fire needs oxygen. When you stop feeding it, it either escalates dangerously or burns out and looks for another source. Either way, the truth surfaces. She wasn't interested in a relationship. She was interested in control, in access, in a dynamic where I managed her emotions while neglecting my own. When that stopped, there was nothing left to sustain the connection. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to expose her. I didn't need her to admit what she had done. Wanting those things was just another attempt to stay emotionally tethered. Detachment with compassion wasn't noble. It was strategic. Every moment I spent hating her was energy she still owned. Every angry text I drafted but didn't send was proof she still occupied my mind. Letting go meant reclaiming that energy. I didn't announce my exit with a dramatic speech. I didn't list her crimes. I didn't try to make her understand what she lost. I didn't explain myself for the 100th time. I said one sentence. I wish you the best, but I need space to focus on my own life. That was it. No argument, no negotiation, no emotional closure ceremony. Clean, simple, unusable as ammunition. I knew she would rewrite the story. Tell others I was cold, uncaring, the villain. I didn't try to control that narrative. People who know you don't need explanations. People who don't were never going to understand anyway. The idea of closure haunted me at first. I wanted her to acknowledge the damage, to apologize, to take responsibility. I believed that without that, I couldn't heal. That was another illusion. Closure doesn't come from toxic people. Waiting for it is like waiting for a mirror to reflect a vampire. Self-awareness would destroy their identity. It was never coming. The closure I needed wasn't in her hands. It was in mine. It came when I accepted that some people are broken in ways you can't fix. That some relationships are lessons, not destinations. That sometimes the only explanation you'll get is that there is no explanation that makes sense to a healthy mind. Releasing resentment wasn't about forgiving her. It was about freeing myself. Anger is poison you drink, hoping someone else gets sick. Bitterness is a prison where you're both the guard and the inmate. I didn't need to understand her motivations. I didn't need to excuse her behavior. I just needed to stop letting her live rent-free in my head. Wishing her well from a distance wasn't weakness. It was power. It meant I could acknowledge that she was likely fighting demons I knew nothing about, without volunteering to be her battlefield. It meant I could recognize that hurt people without signing up to be hurt again. The ultimate act of compassion was leaving, not abandoning her. Ending a dynamic that was destroying both of us, not giving up. Choosing peace, not losing. Winning the only game that mattered. The one where I chose myself. When I stepped away, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel empty for long. I felt light. My energy returned slowly. My clarity sharpened. My nervous system settled. I remembered what it felt like to exist without bracing for impact. That wasn't happiness yet. It was freedom. And freedom was enough. The lesson this story leaves behind isn't about toxic people. It's about self-respect. Most damage in life doesn't come from sudden disasters. It comes from what we tolerate slowly, from explaining ourselves too much, from staying quiet when something feels wrong, from confusing endurance with love and chaos with depth. We don't lose ourselves all at once. We give ourselves away in small pieces, usually in the name of being kind, patient, or understanding. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. Anything that requires you to abandon your peace is too expensive. Love should challenge you to grow, not force you to shrink. Commitment should deepen your life, not drain it. And caring about someone should never require you to silence your instincts or carry emotions that aren't yours. Boundaries aren't cruelty. They're clarity. They don't push good people away. They reveal who is only benefiting from your lack of limits. And choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. You can't build a meaningful life while constantly putting out fires you didn't start. If this story resonated with you, take a moment and reflect honestly. Where in your life are you tolerating what you already know isn't right? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. Tell me what stood out to you or what this made you realize about your own experiences. And if you value conversations that cut through confusion and help you think more clearly about relationships, boundaries, and self-respect, consider subscribing to the channel. Calmly. No pressure. Choosing clarity is a quiet decision, but it changes everything.